Blessings to everyone. Thank you for joining us. With all the turmoil, violence, and chaos around the globe, especially what's going on in Israel, we're going to read about the spiritual war that we believers throughout the world are in. What is the origin of the war, and who is the enemy? Currently, there are many wars and rumors of wars brewing around the globe. Just look at the news. But let's go to the Bible. In Genesis, we read, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." God promised that the seed of the woman, there would be a seed that would come forth and that he would crush the head of the serpent. There would be spiritual war from then on. Satan has known this seed of the woman is coming, and he's tried to stop the seed of the woman because he knew his head would get crushed. He needs to stop the seed of the woman from coming. This verse is a direct messianic prophecy. Genesis 3:15 predicts an ultimate battle between the seed of the woman, that is the Messiah, and the devil. After Genesis 3, the primary purpose of the book of Genesis is to identify who this offspring of Eve will be and where he will come from. After Eve has Cain and Abel, Abel is murdered by Cain. However, God gives Eve another offspring named Seth, who begins the messianic line after Eve. We see that in Genesis 4, verse 25 and 26. In Genesis 5, Seth and his descendants through Noah were singled out as the recipients of the Genesis 3:15 seed promise. Now, which of Noah's three descendants will carry on the line of Eve and Seth and bring us a Redeemer? After the flood in the time of Noah, in Genesis 9, verse 18 through 27, answers this question for us. Ham and his son Canaan are cursed, while Japheth and Shem are blessed by Noah. Furthermore, it is especially the descendants of Shem who are chosen to be the unique recipients of God's presence and divine blessing in the future. Genesis 25 through 27 reads, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Here we see that Shem is given God's double blessing, so much so that the Lord himself is even identified as the God of Shem. Also, when Genesis 9:27 says, "May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem," it is not saying that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem, but rather that God himself would dwell in the tents of Shem. Ultimately, the prediction in Genesis 9:27 that God would dwell in the tents of Shem was also a prediction about the coming of the Messiah. It was Shem who was being singled out as a recipient of the promise related to the Messianic Redeemer in Genesis 3, verse 15. In Genesis 9:27 implies that the Messiah would come forth from the line of Shem, and that God's presence and blessing would come to the world through Shem's divine Messianic descendant. This prediction was fulfilled in the first century, as we read in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus traces his lineage back to Adam and Eve through Shem, not Japheth or Ham, in Luke 3:36. As we will see when we look at more at Numbers 24, Genesis 9:27 is also a prediction of how the divine Messiah will dwell in the tents of Israel in the Messianic age. In Numbers 24, we have the oracles of Balaam. Many of us know the story of Balaam well, including how this pagan expert in divination and witchcraft unwittingly ended up blessing Israel instead of cursing them. In the Balaam story, Numbers 22, starting in verse 1, notes that as the Israelites were preparing to enter the promised land, they traveled east and camped in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan, opposite Jericho. Fearful of the Israelites, Balak, the king of Moab, hired Balaam to come to Moab to curse the Israelites, and basically cast a voodoo spell on God's chosen people. Much to Balak's disappointment, however, God was so intent on protecting the Israelites that all Balaam could do in the end was bless the sons of Israel. and essentially curse their enemies, including Balak. The 4 blessings that make up the Balaam oracles can be found in Numbers 23 and 24. In Numbers 24, verses 3 through 9, we read, "He took up his discourse and said, The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside the river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt. He is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He will devour the nations who are his adversaries, and he will crush their bones in pieces, and shatter them with his arrows. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares rouse him. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you." In verse 24, verse 5, we have the first reference to the Messiah in the 3rd oracle of Balaam. In this verse, Balaam states, "How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel." We need to understand that Numbers 24:5 is alluding back to the earlier messianic prophecy in Genesis 9:27, where it says, "May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem." The reason Balaam exclaimed, "How fair are your tents, O Jacob," was because he understood that it is God himself who dwells in the tents of Israel. Balaam understood that the dwelling places of Israel were utterly unique and worthy of praise because God was in their midst, in the tents of Shem. According to Balaam, the camp of the Israelites was majestic and awe-inspiring, not because they were anything special, but rather because the Most High God has chosen to dwell among them. It becomes even more apparent in Numbers 24:7 that Balaam understood God's awesome presence among the Israelites to be connected to the eventual arrival of Israel's Messianic king. This verse reads, "Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by many waters, and his king will be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted." The first nation that the Israelites faced were the Amalekites. In Numbers 24:20 we read, "And he looked at Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end shall be destruction." Deuteronomy 25:17. "Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt, how he met you along the way and attacked among you all the stragglers at your rear, and when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God." In Exodus 17, we read, in verse 8, "Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, Choose men for us and go out fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." In the times of Saul and David, the Amalekites kept coming back, and they were continually waging war against Israel. They rose up again to terrorize at one point, even raiding David's camp in Ziklag. 1 Samuel 30, starting in verse 1. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. They took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord is God. In the book of Esther, Haman, an Agagite, likely a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, he wanted to annihilate the Jewish people. The situation looked so bad that the entire people fasted in sackcloth and ashes for 3 days, praying against the imminent genocide. Then God raised up Esther with courage to speak to the king on behalf of her people and save the day. In Ephesians 6, verse 12 through 13, we read, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm." So we're not dealing with flesh and blood here. This is also a spiritual war against God, his purposes, and his people. The spirit of the Antichrist, as with Amalek, continues throughout the generations, attempting to wipe out the Jewish people. We saw it in the Holocaust, and we're seeing it play out in Israel and in the Middle East today. There are demonic forces driving these nations to come against God's people. However, brothers and sisters, no matter how much evil they devise and scheme, the Lord is in control. Psalm 2. In Zechariah 14, starting in verse 1, we read, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle." And finally, brothers and sisters, remember, even though the world is in turmoil and all seems hopeless, there is hope. Jesus is coming to deliver and redeem his people once again, and there will finally be peace for the Jewish people and for us as well. Micah 5, verse 5, "He shall be their peace when the Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces. Then we will raise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. They shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod as its entrances, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. Your hand will be lifted up over your adversaries, and your enemies shall be cut off." Thank you for watching, and may God bless you all.